Okay, probably time to get started. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wigner lecture. This is being recorded for later viewing on YouTube, but the only way you can watch it live is to be here. So this lecture series, the Eugene P. Wigner Distinguished Lecture Series in Science, Technology, and Policy, was launched on the 4th of November in 2013 on the occasion of the 70th anniversary of first criticality at the graphite reactor. A reactor that, by the way, was designed by DuPont. This series is organized by our corporate fellows with the goals of invigorating scientific discovery, spurring technological innovation, and initiating productive science policy debate. And of course, it honors Eugene Wigner, kind of a patron saint of ORNL. His picture is actually hanging out there in the lobby. Chemical engineer by training and a physicist by inclination, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1963 on the day he was in Oak Ridge to celebrate the 20th anniversary and the closure of the graphite reactor after 20 years of service to the country. He had to hop on a train and head back to Princeton on short notice. He was also really the founder of the field of nuclear engineering and a role model for coupling of basic and applied work. And he played an important role as the research director of the then Clinton Labs, predecessor to ORNL in 1946 and 47, putting together the strategic plan for the lab, what we, I guess, would call the lab agenda now in terms of the initiatives that they had, and also developed the requirements for building what they called at the time the permanent lab, because, of course, everything during the war was in all those temporary wooden asbestos-filled structures that still honor the landscape slightly west of here. And, of course, that led to the construction of things like 4500 North that was the preferred real estate for many years. During his tenure as research director, our partnership with the University of Tennessee also began to take shape, and of course that partnership has continued to flourish to the benefit of both the university and the laboratory, and I would note that our speaker today is a UT graduate. And in fact, as an industrial engineering student, he took a summer job with DuPont. I think this illustrates the importance of all those summer internships that we host here at the lab. You know, we have about 400 undergrads who come here mostly during the summer. Some are co-op students year-round. And I think for many of those students, that internship is kind of a formative process as they think about what they would want to do for their careers. And I guess you'd have to say the same thing if you go from being a summer intern at DuPont to being the CEO in 1998. Under Chad's leadership, DuPont established a goal of achieving sustainable growth by increasing shareholder and societal value while simultaneously decreasing the company's environmental footprint. And the result was that DuPont evolved from being primarily a chemical company to a science-based product and services company. He stepped down as DuPont CEO in 2009, and today he's the chairman of Royal Dutch Shell and an active member of the international business community. He's the director on the boards of HCA Holdings and CH2M. He's previously served on the boards of Deere & Company and Bank of America, including a term as a chair. So major leadership roles actually across a variety of industries, with oil and gas, banking, chemical company. He's also the chairman emeritus of Catalyst, a leading nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding opportunities for women in business. And he's on the board of the U.S. Council of Competitiveness, and in that capacity and others is very active in goings-on in the nation's capital. He's also served as chair of the Business Roundtable's Task Force for Environment, Technology, and the Economy, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and the Society of the Chemical Industry's American Section, and is a founding member of the International Business Council. He was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2004 and is a former chair of the NAE Council and has served on and chaired several NAE committees, including the Committee on Research Universities, Committee on America's Climate Choices, and the Roundtable on Scientific Communication and National Security. He's the author of Walking the Talk, a book that makes the business case for sustainable development and corporate responsibility, And he's been honored with honorary doctorates from the Polytechnic University in Brooklyn, now part of NYU, Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland, and of course, the University of Tennessee. In his lecture today, Chad Holliday is going to discuss sustainable energy transitions. We talked about this before, and he wants this to be a very interactive discussion. So the way we're going to do this is he'll start off with a few remarks to kind of get people thinking, and then afterwards we're going to sit down and have a conversation to include all of this room. So I tell you that now so that as you're listening to what he says, you can be thinking about where does this lead you in terms of the question and answer session. If nothing else, that will ensure that you all pay careful attention. So with that, I'd like to invite Chad Holliday to make a few remarks.
Good morning. Tom, thanks very much. You've got a great leader here that we've had a chance to work at the Council on Competitiveness and the university study and various things, so you're very fortunate to have such great leadership. And Wayne Davis, the Dean of the Tickle College of Engineering, as it named last Friday, a named college at UT, so it's good to come down. Wayne entertained me for the weekend, except I've got a little bone with him. He said he was going to take me to a football game Saturday afternoon, but there wasn't one. But it was great to be with you, Wayne. Thanks very much. So the topic is sustainable energy transitions. There are 5 critical questions. The first one is, will there be energy transition? Absolutely yes. The next 4 questions, I don't have the answer to. Why it'll happen, what will really drive it, what are we actually going to go to? You know, if we're going to transition, you got to go to something. What is that something? How do we get there? And when is it going to happen? So what I hope we can do in the discussion is maybe talk about the answers to the 4 questions I don't have an answer to. But given the fact the first answer is yes, let me share 3 perspectives with you that I think may be a good grounding for our discussion. One's a historical perspective, about 30 years back from my time at DuPont. One's kind of current state of play, if you will. And then the last thing I want to do is I want to take you inside Royal Dutch Shell, where I work today, because if we don't make an energy transition, we're not going to exist. And so I want to kind of share how we think about that, how we're looking at that, because I think that could be a good part of our discussion, and then we'll get into things. This last weekend, you may have seen the news that HCFCs were added to the Montreal Protocol. And it's very timely. I'd already elected to talk about that this morning because I want to take you back to 1988 when CFCs were thought to create this hole in the ozone layer, and there was a question what we should do about it. I was at DuPont. I was in charge of sales and marketing for all the chemicals, including Freon, which was our CFC. It was actually a class of chemicals that we invented. And we had a CEO about 10 years earlier that said, if it's ever scientifically proven that these CFCs are contributing to the hole in the ozone layer, we'll cease production. And then he went on to do something else, and then somebody else came in. So we're there in 1988. I'm sitting around, absolute true story. 3 of the folks on my team, we're waiting for the answer. Because the National Academy of Science had come out with a study, said it was true, but we hadn't spoken yet. We hadn't spoken to our commitment from 10 years earlier, and we didn't know the answer, but we knew we were going to have a lot of customers very interested in the answer. And so we were wondering, what will DuPont do? Will they question the science, et cetera? I won't take you through all that. But as we read the announcement, no question of the science, we accept it, no need for additional work, let's get on with it. We will cease production in less than 5 years. We will come up with the replacements in less than 5 years, and we will have capacity for all of our existing customers in those replacements in less than 5 years. And you could see everybody just sit up a little bit taller. Boy, we're proud of this company. And then we stopped to think, we don't know how to do that yet. We had 3 leads. None of it had been tested in anybody's commercial equipment. All had been tested in our labs. We didn't know which one would work. And so you think about that commitment for that level of change. Ceasing production is kind of easy. We got 7 plants, just shut them down. but getting the replacements and having enough capacity was a real challenge. So that was a really exciting time to be a part of that. You can imagine explaining that to your customers. You know, we're going to stop making CFCs. Yeah, well, where am I going to get my CFCs? Well, we got a replacement. Well, what is it? We don't know exactly. Well, will it work in my equipment? We sure hope it does. You know, and how much is it going to cost? Well, I don't know, but it probably might cost a little bit more because there's a lot to do with it. So the bottom line is the industry finally came with us. With that industry commitment, Montreal Protocol, the first one, came out, and lo and behold, we did it. In fact, it wasn't just DuPont did it because we shared intellectual property. The entire industry, the total 6 competitors, all had a product available in about 5 years in time. And so I think that looks back as one of the big international treaties that actually worked. Now, it was really simple compared to what we're dealing with on climate change, but it was a start. What I want to point out this morning is the things I think made a big difference in that. There was a public commitment. DuPont made a public commitment, stuck its neck on the line. It's full almost 200 years of experience on the line for reputation. There was a date certain, and there's a quantity certain. So I think those 3 characteristics were really critical in making it happen, because inside the company, if you were working on this, it must be just like it is around projects around here. Everybody knew it was so important. Everybody wanted to work on it. It got priority with all the functions and really made a difference. It was a great honor to me then, flash forward 15 years to 2003, and DuPont was awarded the National Medal of Technology for that work. And Sam Bodman was the secretary at the time, and it was the second time our company had won that honor, which is kind of unique for a company to win it twice. Only one company can win it a year. But so it was really a nice personal experience to go through it from start to end. Let me move now to current events. I've had the chance to work on 3 different organizations that they're playing a role looking at this climate transition, what we're going through, and let me give you just a nutshell from all 3. The first was called the New Climate Economy. This was chaired by Calderon, the former president of Mexico. It was a broad cross-section. It was supported by 7 countries, a lot of NGOs, and no corporate money in it. It was all private money to make sure it was totally objectively done. And the question was, we've always seen there's a debate between do the right thing for the climate and do the right thing for jobs. And people assume it's a trade-off. The question is it possible to do the right thing for the climate and do the right thing for jobs? And so we used McKinsey to do all the modeling, and it took us about a year to do it, but basically looked at the next 15 years and said if we build out an infrastructure that's going to do the right thing for the environment and the climate, do we have to kill jobs? And the net result is if we take the same thing we've been doing in the last 15 years and we build that economy out for 15 years, it's going to cost $89 trillion for the world. That's a lot. But if you do it in a smart plan way, we do it with more of the stuff you work on here with nuclear energy, et cetera, it's going to take $93 trillion. So it's going to take $4 trillion more, but absolutely we can keep with that additional 4, we can keep the GDP the same. So our analysis is that we do not have to give up jobs if we do the planning right and governments take the right action. And we purposely came out with this study about a year before these Paris meeting of COP21, so governments would have a little bit more encouraged to do it. It got very good publicity. It was 11,000 news pickups, which is kind of unusual, in 119 different countries. So I think it made impact. But what was missing from it was now how do I go do that? What's the next step? And so at Shell, we were a supporter of something called the Energy Transition Commission, which is much newer, which is basically trying to ask that next question, how do you go do that? So if you want to do carbon capture and storage as a part of that, how do you make that work? What are the true facts on carbon capture and storage? What's the true facts on hydrogen? What's the true facts on solar, et cetera? So that's the second thing we have going. The first thing that group has done is looked at the intended nationally determined contributions. That's what all the countries agreed to in Paris, intended nationally determined contributions. It doesn't feel real strong to me, by the way. It looks like there's a way to kind of weasel out of some of those because what I intended isn't necessarily what I'm going to do. But it's a start. I think it's a very good start. And what we did is we analyzed all those. And we said, because the UN didn't really add them all up. And our conclusion is we're going to have to do a whole lot more than what was intended by those countries that came together, but a nice start. The last study that I just finished on, this was for the National Academies, and it was a request of Department of Energy. Secretary Moniz was a key sponsor of this all the way through. And this was to look at how do we get a cleaner energy system in the U.S., more renewables, more energy efficiency. And so we've had a typical National Academy study that just completed last month, and we just issued our results. We have 25 very specific recommendations. The two that we highlighted is there needs to be a cost on pollution. Exactly how to do that, we'll leave that to Congress, but we think it needs to be a cost on pollution. And there needs to be a massive increase in R&D. That we don't see any of the current technologies just being able to go down the experience curve enough without massive R&D improvement to get them to where they need to be. So that could be, if that's what's adopted, it could have a big impact on you and your colleagues around the country. So 3 perspectives on where it is today. If I had to sum all that up, we can get there, but we're going to need technology, and we're going to need cooperation, and we're going to need it in a form and level like we've never seen before. So last area I want to talk about before we go to a dialogue session is looking forward. And I want to talk about Royal Dutch Shell, where I work today. I'm the chair of the board. It's a little bit different role, and we're a PLC. We're a British company, although we're headquartered in Holland. We don't have many separate CEOs and chairs here in the U.S. It's generally a combined job. But the role of the chair there is required. There's no choice. They have to have it. And it's make sure you got the right management and make sure you got the right strategy. So I spend a lot of time thinking about the strategy of the company, not actually doing it. The management does the strategy, but the board has to make sure it's the correct one. So we spend a lot of time on that. So let me give you just a little bit to ground you on Shell, because I decided when I was going to come out and put in my talk, I was going to count Shell filling stations on the way out here, telling me they were. I only saw one. That's not a good sign. But Shell is a $260 billion revenue company last year, the 5th largest in the world. Go back to 2012 when oil was a little more expensive. We were number 1 in the world. We have 43,000 stations, which you could not judge from my drive this morning. 43,000 stations around the world, which is more outlets than McDonald's and more outlets than Starbucks. So we're by far, and they're all branded Shell. We only have 4 designs around the world. We're big in a lot of areas. Just one example, we refuel airplanes in 40 countries, and we refuel an airplane every 12 seconds. So it's just a big company, and we're an oil and gas company today. Yeah, we got a few other things, but all that surrounding area almost compared to oil and gas. So that's what we're planning for. That's what I want to have this discussion about is how do you go from an oil and gas company, you accept the fact there's going to be an energy transition, and what do you do to get there? So think it through with me. One of the things we had to do, and our current CEO, Ben Van Beurden, is a great leader of this, said we've got to change what we call ourselves. So we're now an energy solutions company. Now, you won't find that at your local Shell filling station because it doesn't. People just want to get good gas at a good price. I understand that. And that's very different. It's not just an energy company, but it's an energy solutions company. So we're looking at different things. We have a tagline is make the future. Because we believe it will not be just extend the future or other things you could come up with, make the future. And by the way, we have a new commercial. You can get it on YouTube. It's the best day of my life. It's a song. It's 6 new technologies, and it's 6 performers that sing to the new technologies. And if that's not different than a typical oil and gas company, I don't know what is. So if you want to take 3 minutes of your time, make the future the best day of my life, and I think you'll find it hopefully entertaining. We have just published, because we're very good at scenario planning, a better life with a healthier planet. A better life with a healthier planet, which is taking our 40 years of scenario planning and saying, how do we get to net zero emissions? Because that's the goal. We've got to get to net zero. That means there will not be emissions, but we think there needs to be, between forestation and carbon capture and storage, a way to do that. So it's kind of our answer as to how to get there. We've been very reluctant to do that because we were concerned if we put an answer out, people will immediately attack it. So we put it out there very softly. We didn't announce it. We just kind of put it out there. And so we've had actually pretty good response to it. If you're looking for one scenario that will take you about an hour to read about how we get to that healthier planet, that will describe it. So with those as background, so slogans, songs, books, pretty easy to do. Now the risk is, how do you really transform the fifth largest company in the world to a very different company with time? So let me end by describing that. And I would describe it as a bumpy road. Actually, a bumpy, curvy road. So if you look at that, if your first reaction is, well, I'll wait till they straighten this road out and take out those bumps before I start traveling. And that would be very tempting, and a lot of companies are taking that approach today. When you get the answer, come back to me, but right now I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. We concluded that's unsatisfactory. We've got to start. Your other option is you start down that bumpy, curvy road as fast as you can possibly go. We concluded that may make us a little bit sick, may lose a lot of shareholders, and we might just run off in the ditch. So where we've come out is we've got to start traveling that bumpy, curvy road, even though it's bumpy and curvy, and we've got to make progress, and we're going to travel at a moderate rate of speed so we don't run off the road. And then whenever we get to a good, smooth stretch, we're going to speed up. And so we want to have the acceleration capability. When we see the technology, we see the market, that we could go forward. That's what we do. So how are we playing that out? We believe natural gas, because it's 40% less CO2 than coal and 1/10 the other pollutants of coal, is a big part of this transition. Whether it's going to be with us 100 years from now, we could debate that forever, but we don't see any way that for decades to come, that's not going to be a part of the transition. So earlier this year, we bought the BG Group, originally stood for British Gas, $53 billion, nice down payment. On making us almost twice as strong in liquefied natural gas, and by far the strongest in the world. So LNG is something that we were critical in. In 1964, it was first commercialized. It was our technology in the plant, our technology in the transport mechanism, and we're very strong in that today. So that's one way you start down that road, is you double down, if you will, on something that we think has to be a part of the equation and clearly works in the system today. We're the largest biofuels producer in the world with our joint venture in Brazil. So we make it from sugarcane. It's a profitable venture. It makes sense. You can't transform that to North America and other places in the world, but it's a great place to start. And we have a commercial second-generation plant that uses the bagasse, or the waste of the sugarcane, to make ethanol. So we think that's a piece of the equation. We're working very heavily on commercialization of second-generation ethanol technology here in the U.S. We have 2 routes ourselves, and we're also talking with others about licensing. We believe hydrogen for vehicles could be a big piece of the equation, and we've signed an agreement with the German government to fill out 400 stations in Germany that will be hydrogen stations over the next 8 years, as that country tries to go more as a hydrogen source. And we're also in discussions with Japan about the same thing. We're doing it in California. Whether it will be hydrogen that powers the electric motor in vehicles, or whether it will be a much better battery, we don't know yet, but we're staking a piece that we think hydrogen could be a part of that. We do something, and this has been in place for about 10 years, but we've greatly stepped it up. We call it Eco Marathon. So we get high school and college kids to form teams around the world and have a race for fuel efficiency. And so the most fuel-efficient car in the U.S. race this year in Detroit was well over 2,000 miles to the gallon. Now, this is not a car you just don't want to commute in every day. But to see the students work as teams, to see, I had a chance to talk to the whole group in Detroit, and to say, how many of you are going to be engineers or scientists? When you almost every hand went up. So to see that enthusiasm that's going is very important. So it's something we thought was very critical that we make a contribution in. So if that gives you a feel for how we're starting down that bumpy road, plus a new energy group that we just formed that is out searching for all the best technology, the best systems. We're very big power traders, by the way. We trade electricity every day. We're the biggest in the U.S., so somehow it might be a part of trading as well as producing and systems. So I love your ideas and discuss that, but it gives you a window of what Shell's doing, and I haven't told you anything that wasn't public, so I won't have to go to jail because I released some bad stuff. Let me sum up by going back to the questions. Yes, there will be an energy transition. We'd be glad to discuss that with you, but in Shell, we absolutely believe that, and I believe that personally. Why we'll make that change, I left that unanswered. If I had to say, it's going to be a combination of the environment of the planet and a good solution. It's going to be push and pull. There's got to be some technology breakthroughs that pull us more to that, because I don't think people are going to focus enough on the planetary problems unless they see a good reason to make the movement. So much more scientific solutions is important. I think when they look back, and whatever time period it takes, engineering and science will be the answer, and that's how we got there. It will be also a lot of communications, a lot of understanding, and I think engineering and science won't just be around the energy itself. It will be on understanding human behavior, big data crunching to see that. So I don't think about the engineering and science typically the way we think about it. The answer, the what, in my view, it's going to be a lot of different answers. Even with some technology breakthroughs we can't see today. I've had a chance with the United Nations to work on sustainable energy for all. There's 1.1 billion people in the world that did not turn the light switch off last night before they went to bed. Not because they forgot, because they don't have one. 1.1 billion out of 7.3 billion. There are 2.4 billion they're cooking on a stove that's going to reduce the quality of their life and probably the length of their life. The World Health Organization says 4 million people will die prematurely this year with indoor air quality, primarily because of these stoves. So there's a need that us that kind of take those lights for granted, think about as we make this transition for the world, we can't leave those others behind. So I think that's very critical. So I believe the answer in Sierra Leone will be different than the answer in Knoxville, Tennessee to some of these answers. I think that's very understandable. And when's it going to happen? My last question, I don't know. Let's start our dialogue and maybe we'll get an answer. Thank you very much for listening this morning.
Okay, we'll perch ourselves up here. Hopefully won't fall over. So now's the time we're going to open it up to questions, and there's some microphones going around. So as you have a question, please wait for the mic, because otherwise people may not be able to hear you. And I think I'll start, since I have that prerogative, and say, you know, Royal Dutch Shell, like any oil and gas company, has a market capitalization that for the most part is the product of proven reserves times current market price. And so when you start talking about looking out to a world where there's been an energy transition, it's easy for people to be skeptical. I remember when BP came up with Beyond Petroleum, you know, the response was, yeah, right. So how do you counter that criticism, and you know, should we really believe that a company that has that kind of entrenched interest embodied in their market capitalization has the commitment to see it through?
I had a good friend at BP who came up with this slogan, Beyond Petroleum, and forgot to market test it very well. And their investors didn't like this Beyond Petroleum stuff, and after about 6 months, he was looking for a job somewhere else. That struck home with me. But because the answer to the first question is yes, it will happen. And we think so many of our investors understand it will happen today. They actually look forward to us making the right steps. So I mentioned that we spent $53 billion to buy this BG group, but we've also committed to sell $30 billion worth of assets. So basically to pay down the debt that we used to borrow that. So we will be selectively looking at that, and hopefully that will, we don't know yet where that will all be sold from, that will change our mix itself. So it will not all be just, you know, movement to something else. It will be some divestitures of what we have. It will take time. I'm not trying to suggest to you that Shell's going to be a drastically different company 2 years from now. I don't think it'll happen that fast. But I think it'll take decades, but we got to get started.
Let's see, I think we had a question here. Bill's got the mic.
You mentioned Shell's investments in hydrogen, a bunch of other cleaner fuels. Is Shell still investing in the development of oil sands in Alberta?
We still have operation there. We're a joint venture partner there. And that's a very interesting question. You know, one of the things we see is it is more CO2 intensive. And that's why we've just started the Quest Carbon Capture and Storage Project, work with Canada. So when you put our carbon capture and storage project with the oil sands, it will have the same CO2 as oil from a different source. Still not lower, the same CO2. We're still there today.
Thanks for your comments. I was curious about the whole communication side, both in two perspectives, one with your shareholders and the other with the general public. And I'll just give it as an anecdote. When I talked to my next door neighbor, a elderly retired woman, she knows that the climate in East Tennessee is much warmer milder in the winter and hotter in the summer, but it's not climate change. And at a certain point, I just don't know what to say anymore.
As Todd mentioned in the introduction, I've had a chance to work on several National Academy studies, including America's Climate Choices, one of I think the last major ones. Boy, this science is complicated. And so if you try to explain it to someone, the way I do it, it doesn't work, but I really like the story. So basically, this layer of greenhouse gases is a blanket over the Earth. If we didn't have that layer, we wouldn't be here in the form we are today, because that's keeping it warm enough. So we're basically putting another blanket on the bed. Now, if you just kind of think at home, when you put another blanket on the bed, you're going to be warmer. Exactly how much warmer? Well, not twice as warm if it's two blankets, but you're going to be warmer. And so that's the phenomenal. You can't explain exactly why adding another blanket to the Earth makes it warmer, but it's kind of common sense it is. And so I think that's the point. The other thing we found, like at DuPont, we're a very large seed company now too, because we've gone to biotech. And so we have to design the seeds for the growing season. And we can see we're just shifting it north. And we go back over 30 years, we've been shifting north. And that's just what nature is telling us about how long it takes the crops to grow and how much. So there's a lot of concrete data like that I think is useful. The long-term negative impacts, you know, it's a tough story to say the addition that hurricane that came up the coast 2 weeks ago was because of climate change. If somebody says it was caused by climate change, that's not real credibility there. Could climate change been a factor? Of course. But it was caused by a lot of things. So I think it's important for us not to reach at straws like that to try to make the case, even though it's very tempting.
You mentioned penalties on pollution as being a necessary part of the formula. What about tax credits that are openly traded? Do you think that would have, in other words, credits for carbon credits? Would that have, several other oil company people I've talked to are ready, willing, and able to accept that kind of a business.
Still with DuPont, and Shell was a member of this, BP was a member of this too. It was a climate action partnership, and we proposed basically a cap and trade system. We lobbied heavily in Congress for that. It actually passed the House by 3 votes and died in the Senate. But there's a lot of logic to say that a trading system is actually better than a tax. The problem is a trading system is very complicated. There's a chance of people playing games with it, so it doesn't come out with the answer you want. And so I think there's more movement now to a charge. And that's why the study I referred to in the Academy said a charge on pollution. You can do a charge on pollution a lot of different ways. It could be that approach. It could be others. But I actually think incentives that would drive you to the most cost-efficient way. So at DuPont, we had a 62% reduction in our greenhouse gases. And I recall one of my predecessors, Ed Willard, put out the first goal, we're going to have a 5% reduction. Then at the end of the year, we added it all up. Didn't change. No reduction at all. He said, I didn't set the goal high enough. 10% reduction. And he stood and he talked about it. Next year, went up 2%. So he said, this isn't working. Because everybody concludes we ought to do it, but you ought to do it, not me, because I've got these other things I got to do. So what we did was come up with what I refer to in retrospect, we didn't call it this at the time, is internal cap and trade. So basically, if you had a project that was outside your budget, that would bring down your greenhouse gas emissions, there was a separate budgeting process you put those forward. And then what happened is we worked on the most high potential global warmers. So it wasn't necessarily CO2, it was other global warmers. And that's how we got a 62% reduction, because we started that internal cap and trade system. So I think if we just had a even charge, we probably wouldn't have had as much results. So I have a lot of logic for your statement, but it's what's possible in the U.S. I think it's the question.
So it's interesting, your comment on the Montreal Protocol. Just remind people, hopefully many of you remember, one of our previous Wigner lecturers was Susan Solomon, who was quite involved in what I found to be a really fascinating detective story around really nailing the ozone question. And as you said, that was a much simpler kind of thing. It was more quantifiable and actionable. On the other hand, it really did work. And so it does show you that you can make that change. And actually, in that case, it'll be interesting to see. I think maybe because of the presidential election and the fact it's only been a few days, I'm curious to see the response to the HFC move. Whether or not that's going to produce a negative reaction. I mean, it was all within the framework of the Montreal Protocol. That treaty was ratified. It's hard to argue with the mechanics, but and of course, industry was backing it. So it may be that it doesn't create a furor, but you never know in today's environment.
Well, if you look at the details of it, it's pretty extended. It's not nearly as fast as the CFC phase out. And just like with CFCs, the first Montreal Protocol, there's exceptions for developing countries, so they have more time to get there. But when we were doing CFCs, we knew CFCs were eventually going to be a problem. And that's why when the Montreal Protocol was open enough. But the idea, we've had 30 years of getting the CFCs out. So to make that progress is important. And that's a little bit my bumpy road story from Shell. If we can convert to natural gas today, and if it goes 30 years, maybe longer, we've made a lot of progress on reducing those greenhouse gases while we maybe look for maybe a longer-term solution.
Another question, right here?
I've got one over here. I've got the mic.
Oh, yep.
So I have a follow-on to Tom's initial question regarding the sincerity of oil and gas companies to make that energy transition. What is Shell's annual R&D budget, and what percentage of that is devoted to technologies that could potentially be used to make this energy transition?
Our R&D budget's real R, we do a lot of development. I could give you a great big number, but the real R&D, I think the way you do it is 1.1 billion, and about 20% is devoted to that today. And that will never come close to getting the answer. And that's why I described this new energies group we're putting together and where we spend that. We don't know where we're going to spend the money yet, but a lot of it might be outside our labs. So I'm talking about money we spend in our labs, not that we contract out for. But I think that it's going to have to be a major step up. And the issue is, who do we want our friends to be in the future? And I think they will be, as I go to Imperial College, which is the university where we spend the most money in research, and we're doing mostly research around our traditional business. So I think our answer is going to have to be working with other organizations that bring a whole different approach than we have in the past.
So what are the technologies then that you're focusing on with that $200 million?
It's, exact details aren't public, but our biofuels program is a part of that. It's a big part of that. And then we have a separate budget we don't call R&D, where we're just scanning and seeing what else is going on. I don't know exact numbers on that, but that's where I think the biggest potential would be. Let me tell you one thing we're doing that is not in that number. We've got a thing called Shell TechWorks off campus at MIT. You may have ever heard of that. That's what I expected, okay? So nobody. So I just became chair, and people were explaining Shell TechWorks. And one person would explain it, said, well, it's a venture capital thing. They all explained it differently. And so I said, I wonder what this really is. So I called up the director and said, I'm going to be up in your area. Can I come by? So I came by about 7 o'clock at night, went to this place that sure didn't look like it belonged to Shell. Didn't have a Shell sign on it because it was a community energy lab. I walk inside and I find a group of, I may call it ragtag, that I wasn't expecting. They all brought out their hard hats, but I believe they looked awfully clean. I think they might have just done it as I came in the door for safety. I sat around the table, we were eating sandwiches, and I said, what's your experience? Well, if you've had oil and gas industry experience, you don't qualify for this. No one's had previous experience. And most of us are out of the space program. And what they were doing was taking our technology that was in the discovery phase and commercializing it. Their goal is 3 times faster. And it's a group of 55 of the most talented people I've seen that used approaches so contrary to what a big company would do. So one person around the table was the video person. So they don't write reports. They go out in the field and interview the people working with the equipment or have done the research and bring those videos directly back to the people doing the design. So that is an example of where if we could multiply that 100 times over, we think we could be a different company over time.
Next here.
Thank you. One of the things is, well, Shell is obviously largely in the transportation industry for the liquid fuels and the like. What sort of paradigm shifts or paradigm changes do you see in the far future beyond just changing over to hydrogen, possibly?
Well, that's why I couldn't answer the question on when we're going to make the change. As our study that I mentioned with the National Academy of Sciences finished up, we think nuclear energy should play a big part. And I realize that's something that there's a lot of relationship to here, but we think to pass on that opportunity and let our current fleet here in the U.S. decline while some other countries are going up is just a mistake. So we think that's a big piece of it. Right now, I don't see how Shell plays in that. It's not our core strength, but we do know a lot about very big projects. Second thing we're working on that's very concrete today is how we can do more LNG. And we've been, I say a little bit tame, so I've got this, I really like telling this. So we found a big natural gas formation about 250 kilometers off Australia. And too far to run a pipeline back, not very practical. So we said, what if we built the natural gas processing plant on a ship and just processed it at sea and then offloaded it and took it directly to it? Really nice idea when you say it fast. But it turns out, if you think the largest aircraft carrier ever been built, the largest class, we have the water displacement on our ship, which we've now built, of 4 of those. If you're a golfer, the length of the ship is a par 5, to get in perspective. And we got to make it stable enough that it can land in the so-called 10,000-year storm, because you can't move this thing because it doesn't have any power. So you just tie it down real tight and hope it spins. And you got to be able to offload in the roughest seas you can imagine. And you've got to have containers inside to hold the gas so it doesn't flip the ship over in those really rough seas. And this is going to sail here pretty soon, and we're going to anchor it, and we'll see how it goes. But that is a big engineering project. And to talk to the young engineers that are managing the modules on that, that's an exciting thing to do. So look for Shell to push the limits like that. So how can we take things, that could be solar, it could be something else, and take it to a new limit? We are very big power traders and trading electricity. We're the biggest in this country. So, how can we bring our knowledge of the markets in with the supply sources would be answers.
A question here.
Yeah, in respect to your comment on being an energy trader, are you guys accounting for the potential for prosumers and all these new energy player in the markets if solar panels become ubiquitous and you have all these these consumers who are also producers now, are you guys accounting for that, and what sort of role or niche do you guys see yourselves fitting in there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and yes, we are, where it's going to play out, we don't know yet. We can look at countries that have gotten ahead of us, what's happened in Germany, et cetera. But that's why we think we could probably play a role, because if there are excesses that need to be shifted, is we can play the role across the U.S., perhaps in a broader grid around the world. Not that you'll ship it there, but not knowledge and maybe trading futures on things could be a possibility. It's way too early to say what that'll be, but I think it's a great question, and I think that'll be a part of the ultimate answer.
Question here?
You talked about 400 gassing stations for hydrogen in Germany and Japan. How about the US? Is there any limitation to doing the same in the US? And secondly, are you funding any research on hydrogen in the US, particularly biomass to hydrogen?
The answer to the last question, not to my knowledge, are we funding? We do have some hydrogen stations in California, but I think it's like 4, because there aren't enough hydrogen vehicles. They just kind of sit there. We'd be certainly willing, if the market demands there, to fill it out. I think that could be a part of the answer here. So if we do not get the battery technology, we get the ranges we want at the cost we want, at the weight we want, hydrogen certainly could be a part of the answer. So a big question we have to say is, can like the U.S. transportation system deal with 2 systems? Can we go with an electric system and a hydrogen system? Is there enough to make them both work? These are really tough questions, and that's why that road's kind of bumpy. We got to see a few more things on that, but so the technology around hydrogen, because at DuPont we made the membrane, so we've been involved in this for some time, so I've begun to watch it grow. We were very concerned about the safety of bringing these hydrogen units around. That seems to be great confidence that we've gotten over that, and it can be done in a safe way, it can be fueled in a safe way. So now the issue is, does the infrastructure build out enough?
So one thing that strikes me as you talk about, can we deploy 2 systems, batteries and hydrogen and so on. A lot of these discussions about the future state take the form of that kind of system design approach. But if you look historically, that's not how we got to where we are. We call the electric grid a grid, which sort of sounds like it's some kind of regular planned thing, and it isn't. You had local generation, and on an ad hoc basis, interconnects were made, and this kind of thing emerged, which was not really a planned entity, certainly in the early days. Now, since then, there's a regulatory overlay and that sort of thing. The same argument could be made with petroleum. If you look at when the automobile started, there were all kinds of experiments going on. You had electric vehicles, you had steam vehicles, you had Henry Ford investing in ethanol plants in Kansas, and it wasn't clear that petroleum was going to be the fuel source at the beginning, and everyone was placing all these different bets, and in the end, the opportunity to go to Pennsylvania and drill a hole not too deep and have abundant fuel popped up kind of drove the process. So I guess in a way it's a bit of a cautionary tale about how much system planning can you really do in an environment where the economics and the technological opportunities aren't always predictable.
I agree. You go back to the National Academy study, we said a charge for pollution and a big R&D breakthrough. We need a breakthrough. And in our summary, you'll come away and conclude, we just don't think we have it today. So how could I possibly plan for a breakthrough I don't have yet? I don't know what it's going to be. So that's why this road, you don't need to travel too fast. But if you go to Japan, you talk to Mitty. I did it, we were both over for the same conference just a few weeks ago. Talk with Mitty again. They're planning out a system. Now that culture would lend itself to that a bit more than we would here. But will it be a hydrogen system? I went by Toyota and saw Dr. Toyota and asked him that question. And he said, well, I have a hydrogen car, but I'm complaining about it because there's not quite enough hydrogen in it to go from where he is all the way to Tokyo. And the stations are only open during the day and they're not open on weekends. So I've got this range anxiety with my hydrogen car. Yeah, and he was joking, but not totally. So I think there are real questions here on what will play out.
Another question here.
So you mentioned about the road, the bumpy curved road, and you said that when you find the stretched part of the road, you will accelerate, right? And to accelerate, you have to have good horsepower. Now, with like diverse areas, how would you maintain horsepower in clean energy related to hydrogen, for example, and enough horsepower in natural gas and enough horsepower in battery and so on and so on? Are you going to capitalize on partnership, or what is your plan?
So DuPont, DuPont's a 214-year-old company, and it started out making black powder. I'm really going to answer your question. I know it didn't sound like it. But started out making black powder, and we were really good at it. And our niche was our cannonballs went farther than the other guy's cannonballs. And if you just show that to a general, yeah, we can sell that black powder. So we loved our black powder. And then this thing called dynamite came along. And the company's founders, who all had the last name DuPont still, said, if we throw that dynamite in with the black powder people, they'll kill it. They'll find 100 reasons why it won't work. So although we only had one location in the world, we built a second location across the Delaware River in New Jersey to develop dynamite, where the lab was developed and the first plant was developed. And if we hadn't had that separation, I'm convinced we never would have done dynamite, and you probably wouldn't even know the name DuPont today. So I believe that same thing's facing Shell. So as we try to do these different things, we will not do them inside our labs, inside our spaces, and that's why we've got to go very outside. So I think initially we'll use a lot of partners. We'll be in places in the world where we don't have a big presence today. What that evolves to over time, I don't know. But I think initially we've got to bring in thinking from outside the company. Even though we got some very smart people, I think we will be biased by our experience more than we could ever recognize ourselves.
Question over here.
I was just wondering if you think that Shell, so talking about this acceleration thing, in order to go into LNG, you need lots of reserves, and do you think that Shell is geopolitically poised to make that acceleration?
Great questions. And it's what I found, from joining the Shell board, which was different than DuPont, the geopolitical piece is so much more important when you're in the natural resources business, whether you're mining or oil and gas, either one. And so I think we really have a good sense of what those factors are in different places in the world. Do we know all the answers? I don't know all the answers about the U.S., let alone some of these other places that are going on. But we put an awful lot of focus on that, and that's critical. And we have a really good risk analysis of what could happen and stratospheres of what that will be. That's why you see a lot of oil and gas companies always going with partners on projects, because we're managing. Not that we couldn't do it by ourselves. We want to manage the risk so it's more distributed. When you're dealing with a country's natural resources, it has a lot more. It's at the heart of the country, so you have to be a lot more respectful. And if you look at a piece of this Make the Future is shared value. And so as we enter every project, we know we must make it the right thing for all of our partners. We call that shared value, but it encompasses a lot of things. And I think it gets at the heart of your question. You've got to be much more sensitive to that today than you had to be 20 years ago.
Let's see, question back here, John.
Do you see for open source types of innovation as we move forward, and are there any that are logical to you? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's clearly the topic of the day. The topic of the day for the last 5 years. We've got this ideas fair in Shell, and it's kind of intriguing. We say just send us your best ideas, and we'll evaluate them and pick the best one and give you a lot of attention. Well, it's a pretty cheap way to people send their idea. Now, they own the idea. They own the intellectual property. But it gives us such a wealth because we use our own employees to evaluate the ideas. And so you look at our website, and I forget exactly what we call it, but it's an idea. It's global. So that's a different form of open innovation than I think most companies have gone to. Well, I think our challenge at Shell is to be sure that a big company like Shell or BP or DuPont or Dow or any of these, they're kind of hard to penetrate. So we got to make sure the door's open, and that people know how to get into us and how to talk to us, how to bring us ideas.
See, another question over here.
USGS issued a report last year talking about that since the massive production of shale gas in 2009, there are lots of earthquakes happened in some states, such as Oklahoma. Since 2009, each year there will be maybe 300, 500 small 3 to 4 degree earthquakes. And last year, the Oklahoma government has acknowledged the production of those shale gas using the fracking technology is part of the reason of those earthquakes. So from that aspect, I just want to know whether this will be considered as a concern for the gas production in the future, or this is something, nothing to worry?
So a great question. 60 Minutes did a spot on this. If you haven't seen it, it's probably worth looking at. But I think a lot of that from that study was actually pumping the wastewater back in the ground. It was causing the problem, not the actual fracking operation itself. This hydraulic fracturing, which is very key here, is because of DOE investment in research. What was a key thing to make it happen. It's a great find. It's a great plus to the country. There's a number of concerns that we've got to make sure we have it right. Methane leaks, for example, are very critical. So if we're leaking more methane as a result of this, that's an issue. And the seismic activity that you referred to is an issue. We've had a serious situation, not around Shell, but in Holland, in the Netherlands, in the home country of Shell. There's a big natural gas field that's been basically serving the whole country for decades. As we're bringing the level of natural gas down, we're starting some very minor tremors. And so working with the government, we've had to reduce production to manage that. So what's behind your question is very real. We do have to understand what's going on in the geology and are there ramifications. Right now, I believe we've got ways to compensate for that and deal with it, but it's something that's very important. It's also very important from a public perception standpoint. I served on, when Steve Chu was your secretary, served on an advisory panel, and we actually gave a recommendation on shale gas based on that. And to hear the public talk about it is very concerning because there's a lot of concerns about it. So I think we need to be listening very carefully and dealing with all of them. So thank you for your question. It's important.
Another question over here.
I'm just very curious in terms of the different energy portfolios that you're looking at. I didn't see solar really emphasized, and I'm wondering in terms of your investigations at Shell, and what I have read is if you could take the solar energy instant on the outer atmosphere of the Earth, it'd be more than enough energy. Has Shell looked at opportunities to efficiently and safely transmit energy from the outer atmosphere to power stations throughout the world that could help generate the electricity that we need?
Great question. So let me answer that a couple different ways. We're in the solar business today. We're in the solar business in Japan with our joint venture partner. They're doing some leading edge work. Not making any money, but they're doing some really good leading edge work. The technology you describe in this session Tom and I were in Japan, the STS Forum, the Minister of MIDI, their industrial development, talked about that as one of the possibilities that they were doing research on. It's not something that's been core to us. As we look at solar, we have to make sure, can we bring something to the party? If we can't bring some uniqueness, we're not sure it's for us. There's a lot of solar companies way down the pike much farther than we are. But if we could have a technology niche, perhaps like the one you described, we'd certainly be open to that.
Of course, I guess you could argue your biofuels work is effectively solar.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. 'Cause I went to Shell, and I said, we ought to have a thing called big solar, and that would include biofuels. I thought it was a great idea. Nobody else thought it was a great idea.
Well, you know, if you think about it, almost everything that we call renewables is effectively solar, because wind is driven by solar energy. Hydro is driven by solar energy, and biofuels, and obviously PV. But when you say solar, people think photovoltaics.
Which is the argument, well, I lost the argument on that. but rather than make the future, I said, well, it's big solar, because it makes, but you have to stop and explain it to people.
Yeah.
If you have to stop and explain it, tough.
Down here.
Are any of Shell's R&D dollars going towards energy storage technologies, either distributed or on a utility scale? And then how do you view energy storage within a future sustainable energy economy?
Energy storage is the, I wouldn't say the key. It's certainly a key, and it's very close to being the key, because if we get the energy storage right, then maybe, because hydrogen is really just an energy storage technique, just different kind. So tremendous amount of work to understanding every technology out there, as opposed to necessarily, we're doing some of our own research, but it's more to understand what's out there so we can be a part of it as it makes sense. And we're looking at the commercial things, et cetera. I served as the chair of the National Academy of Engineering. I stepped down this July, and we give the Draper Award every year for the best engineering accomplishment. We look back over a period of time and look at accomplishments. And about 3 years ago, it was for the lithium-ion battery. And there were 4 people from around the world that we declared were the major creators of the lithium-ion battery. They were aged 88 to 92. And I spent the day with them. It was a great day. But in talking to each one of them individually, each one was working on a new startup company around a new battery technology, not based on lithium-ion. And each one privately assured me it would be commercial before they died. So even though this has been elusive, especially at utility scale, it's been very, very elusive. It's very, we have cell phones today, so it works at the small lithium-ion. So I think that's the breakthrough. At DuPont, we did research. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, would we have been a step change today? I said, absolutely. We missed that one. But I wouldn't give up. There's so much work going on with different elements that I would say we'll get there, but I don't see anything that's so close that you start doing planning around it yet.
Let's see, way at the back.
Sir, I appreciate your thoughts very much. Prior to coming to the lab, I spent 10 years running large coal-fired power plants. And when we worked with our European counterparts, there was a distinctly different culture in Europe. Most of our pollution control stuff was developed in Europe, much more sustainable generation. It was a mindset that was different that I noticed. You as an American running a European power company, do you notice that also a mindset difference? American companies are profit-driven. Not to say Europeans aren't, but how do we get the American mindset to change where our first thought is, how can we do this better in a sustainable way?
Yeah, I've noticed a difference in the culture in Europe versus the U.S. And there is a lot more attention to the subject. There is a lot more focus by, I'd say, all of our employees in Shell in Europe, less than 10 years service. They've come directly out of their educational experience. They're holding us much more accountable for progress in this area. And basically, if you can't make progress, we're going to go somewhere else. So there's a mindset. Wayne and I had dinner with some of his students last night. There was not quite as strong a mindset as that. They're a little bit more American, even though they're diverse. But I see what you're saying. I actually think there's a little bit of, we should learn a little bit from Europe, but Europe could probably learn a little bit from us too. Because I think some of the solutions to these problems, I would bet they're going to come out of this country rather than other places in the world, just because of our other characteristics that we have. If we could find a way to explain the science in a simple, understandable way, that would be a great breakthrough. And I personally believe the answer is we've got to find leaders we trust who aren't necessarily scientists. They can explain it to us in an understandable way, and I think we'll start to get more movement around the subject.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because I know David Green, who many of you know, who worked here for many years, he's now at UT, was involved in a really interesting study of fuel efficiency of vehicles in the US compared to Europe. And if you look, on average, the fleet fuel efficiency is higher in European markets than it is in the North American market. Certainly this was before the CAFE standards were changing and everything. And they did a fairly careful analysis of the consumer decision process and how people think about buying cars. And what they found is that people are prepared to pay for energy efficiency technology improvements as long as there's a 2-year payback time. And that's the same in the US and Europe. The difference is the price of gas is higher in Europe. So you can spend more on energy efficiency and get that 2-year payback when the price of gas is twice as high. So the reason that the European car fleets were more energy efficient was not necessarily because Europeans were intrinsically more concerned about the environment. It was just that gas or diesel was more expensive. Therefore, it made more sense for people to buy more fuel-efficient cars. So you know, another example along those lines is what's happened in Germany. And you know, great story about deep penetration of renewables into their electric grid, and their CO2 emissions are going up dramatically. They're retrofitting brown coal plants so that they can follow the demand curve because they've backed out of nuclear. So, you know, it's paradoxical but true that the U.S. is one of the few countries that met the Kyoto Protocol commitments on CO2 emissions, even though it never ratified the treaty. It wasn't because we're altruistic, it's because of shale gas and cheap gas prices, and bingo, that technology innovation, which as you mentioned came out of DOE investments in technology, you know, drove the US to get what was a better answer than Germany actually, even though if you look at the public rhetoric, you would say, you know, Germany's got a much more profound societal commitment to green than the US. You know, sometimes I think we do ourselves a disservice in making those comparisons.
I think that's exactly true. But the perception in Europe,
yeah,
we don't get credit for these improvements we've made. And now I think there's also a mindset. So in Shell's world headquarters, 5th largest company in the world, we have 300 parking places in the garage where people can park their car. And we have 1,800 places for bicycles. And they're used about the same amount. So people ride their bike to work. Now, if you're riding your bike to work and you get great public transportation, the car is just not as big a factor. So all of a sudden, it's a different issue.
It's also flat.
It's also flat. But think how good a shape we could be in if we rode.
Hey, I rode my bike this morning. Any more question over here?
Yesterday, when I was watching on television a political rally, and there was a person up waving a coal power flag, I was struck the problem isn't trying to convince that person that climate change is real. It's how do you overcome their visceral fear that they're being left behind, that there really is a future for them. Is if someone's lived for within 20 miles of a coal mine where they're 5 generations of their family has lived, how do they accept this new future that maybe it's going to be brighter for some people, but there's a significant percentage of the population that is obviously concerned that they're being left behind by these changes?
Gosh, that's a great question. It's the same question the dean asked me last night at dinner. I didn't have a very good answer then either. But let me, I think that's the biggest thing we've missed, not only in the energy transition, but also in these trade partnerships. You know, and I think it's a serious stuff. We got to pay attention to it. And we have got to find a way to go in these areas that we know are going to be hit very heavily by coal, have been hit. We're still mining a lot of coal. The coal companies are going bankrupt, but they still keep mining coal. So there's still jobs there, but when those jobs do go away, it's going to be very, very, I think this is something where government's got to step in. I don't think business can do it on its own. And I think a lot of it will be around education. And if we can at least start with the people coming through the system now, then we can start with the educational skills so they can have jobs there. You know, with the connected world we have today, you can do a lot of things from West Virginia, if you just pick a state, that you couldn't do before and have jobs there. So I think that's something we've got to take much more seriously, or there's going to be a great resistance to any progress here. Rightly so. By the way, it's not just this country. You know, we were in Japan last week, and the head of the business association there, happens to be a good friend, was arguing for their clean coal technology. And arguing that they're going to take their coal use up over time, you know, and bring back their natural gas use. So it's not just our country that has that need or has that desire.
Question back here.
This is kind of a follow-on question to a comment that Tom made earlier, and this gentleman as well. Much of a company's share price is based on book reserves in the ground, and of course the assumption that those reserves will be produced and burned. Oil companies expend a lot of capital in trying to replace those book reserves. So given the fact that there's probably not going to be a major change in that in the foreseeable future, should the focus really be on net zero emissions and how you try to achieve that, recognizing that's a pretty big challenge in and of itself?
So it's a really good question. As I go out and see investors for Shell, they're asking me the flip side of that question too. Are you going to have reserves you'll never get to use? And so that's another part of the dialogue. And we've looked very carefully at that. So we think about our reserves with that in mind. So far, I'm not concerned about that issue, but just because of the timing to get things done. But it's something we have to watch. You know, why a shareholder buys a company stock? I don't know sometimes. You know, so you say it's reserves. We've got a great dividend. You know, where else can you get a 6.9% dividend today? So why doesn't everybody rush out and buy our stock? Well, some reason you don't. Maybe it's because you're worried about reserves or something else. So I think there's a lot of factors, and that's why a company's got to be able to tell its story. And I think what's the most important thing in the role of big business today, be it natural resources company or not, is to tell the truth, tell the whole truth, tell it all the time, tell it fast. You know, I think ethics and credibility is so important. So I think an investor looks at a company, maybe I don't like what they told me, but I know they told me the truth, and they told me as soon as they knew it, I might buy their stock. And without throwing shame, but what's happening with Volkswagen today and what that's casting on engineering overall is terrible. So I think it's very important, and that's one thing we really focused on Shell, doing that part of the equation right too.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, so you can be the last question.
Thank you. Just a quick question or a quick request. You mentioned Imperial College. Could you highlight some of the high-level research that's done there? Also, maybe we could encourage research collaboration with ORNL and UT, if appropriate, in that part.
Where do I pick the accent from?
I didn't graduate from Imperial College, but we had a former ALD that did, David Hill.
That's great. So I would say, again, it's our largest partnership anywhere in the world. It's also their largest partnership with any one company anywhere in the world. And it's very much along traditional lines, around geology. It's around the upstream end of our business. There's some around our chemicals business too, but it's not on solar, it's not on bio, it's not on some of the things that I was referring to that you know, you'd hope our largest cooperation would be more balanced. And I think it will be over time. That's a great question. Can I ask you a question? Sure. What is it about Oak Ridge that the business community doesn't understand that we should understand?
Well, I think one thing that we've worked really hard on in the last several years and have had some success in, but maybe it's not as widely understood as we would like, is that we're actually very eager to work with companies. I think we're pretty, for a government lab, I think we're pretty flexible and nimble about how we go about structuring those arrangements. And government lab and flexible and nimble aren't often words that you hear in close proximity to one another. And I think we've got now a number of examples that we can point to that actually prove what I said. And so that's the thing that I think it would be good for us to make people more aware is, from our point of view, all this work, all this wonderful research that we're doing is funded by the taxpayer 98% on the basis of a payback to society in some form through the creation of new jobs around new industries, through products that are more energy efficient or have reduced environmental impact or fortification of our national security posture, whatever. There are societal impacts that we want to have. Yet we don't make anything and we don't sell anything. So the only way we get to have our impact is by connecting with people who make things and sell them. And so it's essential for us in executing our mission to have those relationships. And in some sense, it's our responsibility how to figure out the complicated, messy government side of the equation and hopefully present a face to business that somewhat mitigates the reality that we are a federal institution. And I'm not sure that we've yet made that. We have examples we can point to. There are specific companies that we work with in various different ways that I think are quite pleased with the outcome. But I think if you just do a random sampling, we're better known for our history than what we're doing today, which we're very proud of the history, but we're in the process of hopefully making a future history as well.
That's great, great. So I'll take that away. It's something. Look, just in closing, from my perspective, this is an exciting time, and working in a facility like this, I'm ashamed to admit it's my first visit. First time I've been invited to come, but it's my first visit to this facility, even though I went to school up the road in Knoxville, and it's just an exciting place to be. And I think science and technology is going to be so much more important over the next 20 years than it was in the last 20 years. And you look at how important it was in the last 20 years, that's saying a lot. So I just think cooperations between, as I ask you the question, cooperation between business and the national labs here is something very special that the U.S. has that other countries don't have. So thank you.
Well, thank you, and let's thank our speaker. So I'd like to thank everyone who helped organize this. I remind you that later this week, we're having not a Wigner lecture, but a director's lecture with Chris Elias from the Gates Foundation. So if you want to come and he wants to have a dialogue as well, but we'll be talking about pandemics and such things. And I think we know they're not good. So just to remind everyone, and we have a plaque, or actually it's a large blunt instrument. I guess it's probably over here. Where is it? Oh, there we go. You don't have to carry this all the way back, but this is the Eugene P. Wigner Distinguished Lecture Series in Science, Technology, and Policy. And I think today's conversation hit all three topics of science, policy, and technology and the way they come together. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.